Ms. Berry, your organization has been at the forefront of protecting the Arab American community and navigating the domestic terrorism threat in the post 9/11 world. You have voiced your opposition to the creation of a new domestic terrorism statute during your opening statement here today, and you noted your concern that additional authorities could potentially adversely impact civil rights and further harm communities of color. So my question to you is, if additional authorities are not the right approach in your estimation, what should the federal government be doing to counter this threat while at the same time balancing civil liberty concerns?
Thank you, Chairman Peters, for the question and the way that you reframed it, because I think that is the key question. The reason we believe that a new charge is not necessary is that there are existing 57 different statutes that apply to crimes that meet the definition of terrorism. Of those, 51 apply to both domestic and international terrorism. So from our perspective, there needs to be a different approach that understands the threat that we face today. I think one of the most important things that's happened, frankly, is the change during the recent election is that we are actually discussing it as the problem that it is. The Biden administration did release a strategy. While there's a lot there to think about and address, and I think congressional oversight will be key to talk about its implementation, the fact that we are now taking it seriously enough for a strategy to be issued is important. The FBI had not released data on domestic terrorism since 2005 until the report that they released recently in May of 21, just this year. So I think we do see an uptick now in what is happening, and that is looking at this threat that is posed and trying to determine how to best address it. I think that 20 years after the horrific attacks of 9/11 is a good time for us to reevaluate what was passed with the Patriot Act, look at the sunset provisions that were put in place, and say, does it make sense for us to sort of double down on the counterterrorism approach that we've taken? I will share with you, Mr. Chairman, that I was doing a press interview once about this very topic, and the reporter kept saying, so I don't understand, you oppose a new charge. And I said, yes, sir, and I explained why. And he came back to, so what you're saying is, doing to white supremacists what was done to your community, that's not something you want? And my answer was, sir, our approach is about dealing with the violence that puts us at risk, our country and all of our communities. I saw a community, both Arab Americans, American Muslims, and others, whose rights were violated under this setup. So from our perspective, no, I don't want other Americans' rights violated. I want the violence addressed. I want our First Amendment protected in that process. I want our Fourth Amendment protected in that process. I want to hold constitutional protections while we go after the very real threat that communities are facing.
Thank you. Ms. Newman, in your opening comments, you suggested that we do need additional authorities. After listening to Ms. Berry's comments, I mean, I hope you take those in consideration as you answer this question, is why are the government's current tools not enough to combat this threat in your estimation?
Thank you for the question, and I imagine that Ms. Berry and I actually agree on a lot more than where we vary. I too believe 20 years post 9/11, it would be a really great idea for us to reflect. A lot of mistakes were made. In my written remarks, I note that we have more terrorists today than we did on 9/11. That's very sobering as a counterterrorism person. I thank the Lord that we haven't had another 9/11. That is a success that we should all be proud of. But there are some costs to that, and one of those is that I found it really jarring in recent months to hear from people like Ms. Berry and the Brennan Center and other communities. You had panelists on Tuesday who basically said, this is how I interpret it, I don't trust the government to not abuse any new tools we give them. That should cause us all to pause. And I'm not in government right now, but I associate with it, and I think that means that we need to reflect. We didn't get some things right in the last 20 years. So I fully agree that we should reassess. At the same time, I look at the way the law currently treats similar crimes, if done in the name of a white supremacist ideology versus in the name of ISIS, those crimes are treated differently. Now, my colleagues former colleagues in the government, they are doing their darndest the way the laws are written to go after the threat. They take the threat seriously, and they recognize the perils of what it would look like to try to open up this conversation and talk about changing the law. They recognize that that's very difficult. So they're doing the best they can with the tools that they have. I would think that it would behoove us as a people to have a commission that looks at this problem, looks at our mistakes, updates the law and on all sides, not just for domestic terrorism, but we've got to do counterterrorism better. And I think from an equal justice under the law principle, the laws need to be right-sized so that we're treating the same crimes the same, regardless of the ideology. And the second thing I would point out is that domestic terrorism ideologies are increasingly global in nature. And that gray area is posing challenges for our colleagues in the executive branch, trying to know where that line is. Having Congress say, here's where the line is, would be better than them guessing.
Thank you. Mr. Levin, you have warned about political rhetoric from our leaders, noting in a Time magazine article that, and I'm going to quote you here, leaders must be aware of the impact of their position on civic and social cohesion. Otherwise, terrorists will gain strength in the cracks that divide us, end of quote. Could you describe the correlation between political rhetoric and spikes in violent incidents against racial, ethnic, and religious groups to the committee?
Absolutely, and thank you so much for the opportunity. You know, it harkens back to President Lincoln's first inaugural address, where trying to keep a country together, he said, to appeal to the better angels of our nature. And you know what? He was right. He might not have been effective at that time, but his words have sustenance. Let me give you an example. 6 days after 9/11, President Bush, a conservative person of goodwill, went to the Islamic Center of D.C. at 3:40 in the afternoon and decried the violence against our Muslim American brothers and sisters. You know what? Hate crimes dropped precipitously the next day, according to FBI day-by-day ticks. And it dropped precipitously into the new year. We went from 481 to just over 100 in those 2 years. But the very next day and into the next week, conversely, our community was attacked in San Bernardino. Everybody got together. Everybody. The Muslim community raised money. We had interfaith. Do you know what? We had 0 hate crimes in the city of San Bernardino, but that wasn't the case for the rest of the country. We saw a significant increase from about 0.67 per day to about 2.5 per day. And then 5 days later, candidate Trump made the terrible proposal of a Muslim ban. And hate crimes against Muslims increased another 23%. Let me just add, by the way, Arabophobic hate crimes went up too in both instances. The issue is words matter, particularly when it's coming from leaders. Interestingly enough, when President Trump launched his campaign and spoke derisively about Latinos, during a very tight news cycle where major candidates were about to launch and we had the Mother Emanuel massacre, hate crimes against Latinos did not go up. But once he became first in the polls and he made statements with respect to various communities, we saw absolute correlations. And we saw it again last year with regard to anti-Asian hate crime. One thing, though, that I think is important to note, we often have a catalytic event, then a feedback loop that is fed online, then certain influencers take this bigotry, and then when you have it from the top, boom. And we saw that in 3 distinct clusters last February and March with anti-Asian hate crime. It's something that we see demonstrably again and again, and I gave you the figures with regard to these election times, a clustering of extremist homicides around the conflictual midterms, as well as an increase in hate crime. Indeed, the first worst month of the decade, November 2016, and the day after was the worst day for hate crime going back to June 2003. Second worst month, October 2018. And then, tied for the third worst month, was August 2017, the month of Charlottesville. But the hate crimes peaked in the 6 days of and after the Very Fine People statement.